Hi everyone, in this video we are going to review our 3 focus literary elements for The Telltale Heart. Those elements are point of view, mood, and irony. Our goal with this video is to make sure that we really understand not just what each of these devices are, but how they actually function within a story. Let's start with point of view. Point of view is, of course, the narrator's position in relation to the story being told. So the question you want to ask yourself is, who is telling the story and from what vantage point? So we have 4 different types of point of view here on this image. We have first person, second person, third person limited, and third person omniscient. Let's break down how each of these are different from each other. Now, first person point of view, as you can see from this image, is a character that's actually inside the story. Notice how this little guy right here is amongst the other characters, and he is relaying the events of the story from his own perspective. So we're going to hear pronouns like I and me and my to describe his experience of the story. Now, second person is sort of a unique perspective. We don't see it a ton in fiction text, but we'll see it a lot in nonfiction, particularly tutorials or self-help type books. And that's because the predominant pronoun in second person is you. It's where the narrator is actually speaking to us, the reader. All right, so know that that is rarely used in fiction. It is used, but we don't encounter it all too often. And the pronoun we're usually listening for is you. Now, third person is where we have a narrator that is actually outside of the action of the story, looking in and relaying the events as they see them. Now, the way that we determine the difference between these two is just how large that narrator's focus is. So we're going to hear he, she, and they in both cases, but we have to ask ourselves, how many different characters are we actually following? Or how many different characters do we know the thoughts and the feelings of? In the case of third person limited, we're kind of following around one character throughout the story. A lot of times it's the story's protagonist. And it's as if there's a cameraman following he or she around and relaying all of their experiences, all of their thoughts, and all of their feelings. Now, third person omniscient, notice this is up here in the clouds. It's sort of like this all-seeing, all-knowing eye in the sky. And this omniscient narrator is actually able to tell us about the thoughts and the feelings of multiple characters. All right, so again, third person, we hear he, she, they, because we're outside the action of the story. But we want to determine, are we only looking into the hearts and mind of one character, or are we aware of the thoughts and feelings of multiple characters? Now, each of these points of view is totally valid, and they each create a very different effect on us, the reader, and our experience of this story. I want you to think back to the difference between The Telltale Heart, which was told from a first-person point of view, and then The Most Dangerous Game, which was told from a third-person point of view. How are those two experiences different? Well, most people would say that first person really sort of like puts you in the story. It's like you're experiencing things almost as if they're happening to you or right in front of your eyes. Whereas third person gives you a little bit more distance. It's kind of nice. It's kind of like watching a movie unfold, right? You have that same little step back that the narrator does, and you're kind of watching things unfold like a play. Now, an additional interesting little detail about first person is what we encountered in our story last week, which was the slight twist on this point of view called the unreliable narrator. One of the things that we have to remember is that when all of the events of a story are filtered through only one person's point of view, we have the potential for bias, right? it's possible that this person has a slightly skewed perspective on the world around them or the events that are taking place. In the case of the Telltale Heart, our narrator was very, very clearly suffering from insanity, which added to his unreliability. But there's lots of different factors that could make a narrator unreliable. Perhaps they are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, right? And that might impede their perspective or their judgment. Or maybe the story is told from a very, very young character. To Kill a Mockingbird is narrated from a 5- and 6-year-old perspective. So everything that occurs is filtered through the eyes of a child. And naturally, that impacts the reliability of that particular point of view. But of course, each of these provide us with a very unique experience of a story. And so authors always have to make a very important decision at the beginning of their writing process. Who's going to be that narrative voice? Now let's take a look at a few examples of various excerpts from different texts, and let's see if we can't walk ourselves through the process of analyzing what narrative point of view is being used. Go ahead and carefully read this text to yourself. You're welcome to pause the video, make your assessment, and then let's check your answer. All right, so our first excerpt reads, Igor looked suspiciously at his partners. Suddenly, the Red Robber and Johnny the Kid did not seem like such trustworthy companions to Igor, and Igor was not the only suspicious one. Suspicions ran rife in the camp. The Red Robber and Johnny the Kid had grown increasingly doubtful of Igor's loyalty. They felt that Igor was using them as stepping stones in Igor's saga. The whole camp was a tinderbox on a powder keg, and Johnny the Kid would be the one to spark it off. So I always start by asking myself, what pronouns does the narrator seem to be using? Do we see I, me, my? Do we see you? Or do we see he, she, they? In this case, we say a lot of his and let's see, a lot of first names, Igor's, Red Robbers. We've got multiple characters, right? So we've got a lot of he, she, they. We don't see any I or me. So we can go ahead and narrow this down to third person. So that leaves us with two choices. The next question I might ask myself is, how many different characters am I able to learn the thoughts and feelings of? Well, we definitely get some information about Igor up here. He looked suspiciously at his partners, right? But then down here, we get a little bit more information about some different characters. The Red Robber and Johnny, the Kid, had been growing increasingly doubtful of Igor's loyalty. Since I'm able to gain perspective into the thoughts and the feelings of more than one character, I can confidently say this is third person omniscient. Let's take a look at a second example. The dishes flew and the engine of turmoil raged. That was the sound of my parents fighting. I wish they got along, but wishes don't amount to much in the real world. Goals do, however, and I have several goals. Go ahead and pause for yourself and make your determination as to what point of view is being used. All right, well, hopefully your eye jumped to the fact that we have a lot of I and me in this particular excerpt. I, me, my is a strong indication that this story is being told from inside the action, making it first person. Let's take a look at this. Bruce Hand felt hunger pangs as he sat in the bush. The birds twittered around him. He was waiting for his contact, Jet Hawkins. Bruce Hand checked his watch. He realized that Jet was late. Then he heard the sound of an engine. He looked through his binoculars and saw Jet's familiar orange and brown striped Humvee driving through the jungle. Bruce ran from the bush onto the beaten path. "Jet, I'm here," Bruce Hand shouted, and the Humvee stopped. All right, again, go ahead, pause your video briefly, and make a determination as to what point of view is being used. So we always ask ourselves first, what pronouns are being used by the narrator? In this case, we're back to he, she, they. So we can confidently narrow this down to third person, but is it limited or is it omniscient? So we have to really look at where the focus is. This whole excerpt focuses around Bruce. Now, there are other characters in the story, but we're not really looking at their perspective. We're really only focusing on Bruce's experience of these events. So we would say that this is third person limited. Now let's go ahead and visit a couple more reminders about point of view. Yes, it's good to be able to identify things as first, second, third, but we also want to remember that point of view is larger than that. Point of view is really about who is telling the story. Who is this unique individual? That includes the attitudes, the perspectives, and the experiences expressed through the narrator and the central characters. So you really want to think to yourself, who are these people as unique individuals? What do we know about their identities that shape their unique perspective on this story? Another important differentiation to make is the difference between the author's point of view and the narrator or the character's point of view. Now, the author always has a point of view on what they are sharing, but that doesn't always have to be identical with the narrator's point of view. Remember that the narrator is a creation of the author's imagination, so they can do anything they want with the narrator. So if we think back to The Telltale Heart, yes, our narrator is a raving madman, but that's not to say that Edgar Allan Poe was himself, a deranged murderer, right? They can have two very different points of view because that narrator is a creation of the author.